The Sphinx is composed of 3 separate levels of rock strata. Starting with the head and above is the hardest, and then the majority of the body, which has alternating soft and hard levels of limestone, and then another layer below, which kind of dips through the plateau. And it kind of dips from 2 angles, and it comes from, ancient architects, history for granite, history with Cayley. And so, the whole point is I like to look at the big picture, put all the pieces on the table. Where I see a lot of the alternatives will often cherry pick certain aspects to fit their narrative. I try to put everything out there and try to give as much information as possible and let the people decide. And then if they ask for my opinion, I'll let them know. And a lot of them are often disappointed because people come on my tours expecting John Anthony West narrative, my mentor. We didn't get into it, but John Anthony West is known for his redating the Sphinx.
Yes, and you were talking about it based on aquatic
water erosion. Right. Which I don't agree with his final conclusion. While I respect my mentor and I've learned a tremendous amount from him, I do not share all of his conclusions. I do not think the Sphinx is much, much older than the Egyptologists tell us. I don't think it can be older than 3500 BCE.
Let's start with this. Let's break down his theory, and then let's break down yours. Go.
Okay, so his theory is that the Sphinx is much older than traditional Egyptologists tell us. Why? When he was reading Schwaller de Lubitsch, who was an esotericist who had moved to Egypt, studied the Luxor Temple. Schwaller was a prodigy. At age 16, he was lecturing before the Theosophical Society doing a treatise on Pythagorean number mysticism, how numbers correspond to cosmology.
Right.
And he was an esotericist. He had an esoteric background. So he approached Egyptology with this unique esoteric perspective where all the traditional Egyptologists, most of them, they're either Christian or they're strictly into the science. They're not going to pay any attention to the esoteric stuff. It's all woo-woo to them, which is unfortunate. There is a lot of woo-woo. There is a lot of charlatanism. But there's also people that are very serious. And I believe that Schwaller was a serious scholar and had a different understanding that he brought to Egypt. And he interpreted things in a different way. But in that process, at the end of his book, he writes this observation about aquatic water erosion. And what I was saying before that you won't hear anywhere else, it goes before him. He was influenced, in a sense, I wouldn't say his mentor, but he was influenced by St. Yves, who we talked about earlier. St. Yves believed the Sphinx goes back to maybe 12,000 years before the actual date, and that it was the product of refugees from Atlantis. However, there was no science to back that up. He was speaking strictly philosophically, in a sense. Schwaller started making a case for that. And so Schwaller acknowledges that there's water erosion, but doesn't pay much attention to it. For West, a light bulb went off. Well, if it's water erosion, that's geology. Geology is science. So even though we have all these historical documents and texts that Schwaller's trying to make a case for a much older Egypt, this is science. And if we can put science to it, it can be proven. John was writing his books, and then eventually he was introduced to Dr. Robert Schoch, who is a geologist. John didn't have the credentials. John didn't have the ability to go and present this in the academic space. He'd be ridiculed, and he was ridiculed. But then when he got with Schoch, Schoch has the certified credentials. He's a geologist, paleontologist, at Yale. He teaches at Boston University. And when he went with John Anthony West to the Sphinx in the early 90s, and a lot of people credit him today because West has passed, Schoch is still alive. Schoch does a lot of conferences, and people often attribute the whole water erosion theory and hypothesis to Schoch, but it originates with West and even before West.
Yeah, but they both played a role.
They both played a role. Yeah. And so he brings in Schoch, and when they go there, they look at the water erosion, and then Schoch ends up coming back with Thomas Dobeke in the early 90s. Thomas Dobeke he was a geophysicist, brings in state-of-the-art equipment. They do a seismic refraction survey, like tomography, where they study the ground. Basically, it's based on the exponential kinetics of the stone. In other words, if you cut stone, it's exposed to the light, and then it starts to deteriorate over time. And that deterioration is exponential, but it slows down. It's kinetic. So they use this whole process. From that, they're able to establish different, interpretations, which they did for dating the Sphinx. So there's 2 key observations. So John's original observation is that, if there's water erosion on the Sphinx, he went and he checked it out, and he's like, sure enough, this Sphinx looks heavily eroded. This limestone sculpture, some 70 feet tall, 270 feet wide, arguably the most spectacular sculpture on Earth, looks heavily eroded. And to understand what's going on here, it'd be important to give a brief lesson on the geology of the Sphinx. Sphinx Geology 101. The Sphinx is composed of 3 separate levels of rock strata. Starting with the head and above is the hardest, and then the majority of the body, which has alternating soft and hard levels of limestone, and then another layer below, which kind of dips through the plateau. And it kind of dips from 2 angles, and it comes from like southwest to the northeast, and it kind of rolls. So it makes it very complex. The simplest way of explaining it, you can think of the Sphinx and the geology of the Sphinx as a layer cake. This becomes important later, of stone. This becomes very important later. So when John looked at it, you could see the body, which is what they refer to as member 2, or the second layer of limestone in the Mokattam Rock Formation at Giza.
The Mokattam Rock Formation.
The Mokattam Rock, that's what it is. People call it a plateau. Okay. It's not really a plateau. Anyway, it's neither here nor there. So John observed this erosion. In fact, this story gets retold different ways. I've heard people say others have done. It was John who brought this to a curator at a museum, and he showed them an image of eroded stone, and he put duct tape across the bottom and the top of the image. So you just see the main body of stone. It's heavily eroded. And they're like, oh, it looks like erosion, heavy erosion, water erosion. John rips the duct tape off and reveals the face of the Sphinx. And they're like, oh, this is the Sphinx. John knew that he was onto something, but he didn't have the credentials. So he needed to have Schock, a geologist, come in and verify it, which he did. John originally thought, and this is what I love about John Anthony West, because if was the last of a dying breed who has transitioned already, because if he was wrong and it could be demonstrated that he was wrong, he would stand correct. And he did, because he originally wrote, he thought it was Nile flooding because Egypt doesn't see that much rain. The Sphinx is supposed to have been carved from the living bedrock during the period of Khafra, which is the second pyramid in the chain at Giza. You have Khufu, his son Khafra, and then Menkaure. And during the time of Khafra is when the Egyptologists say that they believe the face of the Sphinx is likely Khafra. And so this is around 2500 BCE, okay? And so the problem is that if there's this water erosion, it doesn't really rain like that in Egypt. It hasn't been that wet throughout Egypt. And before that, you have like the Naptian pluvials, you have the African humid period where there was rain in Egypt. Egypt used to be a savanna. In fact, dozens of times Egypt has gone from desert to savanna. It's transitioned over the years. And when we look at the geology, one thing that's important to keep in mind, some of the erosion we're looking at is millions of years old. In the stone. It's been desert, tree, vegetation, desert, vegetation throughout cycles of time.
Do we know what causes that?
I'm not a geologist. I'm uncertain, actually. I'd have to dig into more of the geology.
That's a great answer.
Yeah, I don't have an answer, and I don't want to steer you wrong and pretend I do. A geologist could better explain it than me.
Sure.
I just know over long periods and cycles of time, the way that the planet's affected is going to affect the landscape, and like the Nile has shifted. The Nile used to be closer. The Nile shifted. Anyway, so if you have this water erosion, how could that be possible if Egypt didn't have, that was the whole thing, right? The mystery of Sphinx. How could this be possible if there's no rain? So John thought this might have went back it survived the Great Flood. When Schock came, he said, no, it's not Nile flooding. It's precipitation-induced water erosion. He made 2 observations. One of them was the erosion. On the body of the Sphinx, the core body, which is what Schwaller referred to, the body, not necessarily the head, which is the hardest, and not below, which is covered up with stone masonry today, but the core body, the middle part, is heavily eroded. And you can see where water runoff may have impacted the Sphinx. But more so, the real evidence is in what's known as the Sphinx enclosure. The Sphinx was dug out from a ditch. It's not a statue. It wasn't built. Stone was removed to form a ditch, and then they believe those stones are what made the temples in the front, although there's controversy around that, maybe not. Anyway, and then they fashioned this sculpture, the statue. So if you want to envision the Sphinx, it's going through several stages. Originally, it would have been what's known as like a yardang, basically an outcropping. Everything would have been level from the neck up. From the neck up is where the people would be walking, the surface level. And it was just a giant piece of stone, outcropping stone. At some point, somebody started to dig down and fashion a trench around it. And then they fashioned the body. And this is another thing. A lot of people talk about, oh, the head of the Sphinx had to be carved down. It had to be a lion previously. Why? Because if you look at the Sphinx, if you want to pull it up on the screen, try to find an aerial view of the Sphinx. So like Giza or Egypt Sphinx aerial view. When you look at the Sphinx, you'll notice that the head appears to be disproportionate to the very long body. Small head, big long body with a rump in the back. Okay, so
the second one right there?
Second one maybe. Well, actually, that's fine. We'll go with that. Well, the one right in the middle. Yeah, so actually, it's hard to tell from here.
The fourth one, you want that one? Right there?
That might be better. How about this? Put in Sphinx head disproportionate, and maybe because there's better images where you can see.
All right, so let's type in Sphinx head disproportionate. Let's see what we get there. Never gets old looking at this. I don't care what angle you look at it from. It's just amazing.
It never gets old going there.
It doesn't get old. All right.
What we want. All right. Well, all right. The one far right, second row, far right. No, go back. Well, yeah, that's showing. All right. All right. Right below that to the right.
Right there.
That.
Okay.
So we can see, this isn't the best example, but we can see the head in the front looks really small compared to this long body with the tail that wraps around. So people are like, oh, it couldn't be the real head. It had to be the head of a lion. You can see an example in the middle there. Maybe it was originally a lion. It existed before pharaonic times or early pharaonic times, and then they carved it down into the face of a pharaoh. We're going to settle this and set the record straight right now here on the Julian Dorey podcast.
Let's do it.
The reason why the head of the Sphinx appears to be disproportionate is because if you look at the back of the Sphinx, it's actually not disproportionate to the original concept of the Sphinx. What I mean by that is the Sphinx we see today isn't even your great-great-granddaddy's Sphinx. There's been so many restorations over time. But originally, you have this outcropping of stone. They start to dig a ditch around it, and then eventually they form the body. And then there's been many restorations from the Old Kingdom, the New Kingdom, all the way up in the Greek and Roman times into modern restorations, where they're adding stone masonry around the Sphinx. Originally, well, in the back of the Sphinx, right before the hunch, right before the rump, there's what's known as the Great Fissure. It starts on the plateau, it goes through the enclosure wall of the plateau, and runs through the back of the Sphinx, right before the hump, right before the butt. There's a big crack that goes through the Sphinx. Originally, that would have been part of the bedrock, and everything forward would have been your original body of the Sphinx. So the reason why people say the head looks too small for the body is because the body we see today has been expanded to accommodate the Great Fissure. And if people actually looked into the Egyptological, it's been expanded. And if people took the time to actually look into the body of Egyptological work, you go to the sources. Mark Lehner, who's an eminent Egyptologist, he's probably the foremost authority besides, say, Zahi Hawass, who's really more of a face for tourism and stuff. Mark Lehner, his office was in between the paws of the Sphinx. He studied it every day, stone by stone. Few of those who know the Sphinx better than Mark Lehner. And he did a whole survey, literally stone by stone, of the Sphinx. And in his dissertation, which is hundreds of pages, I've read it several times, you can find his dissertation online. On page 410 or 408 of his dissertation, somewhere in there, don't quote me, in between 410 and 408, it's either the first or the second paragraph, he references this and talks about how the fissure is expanded in the back.
Thank you guys for checking out this clip. If you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe and hit the like button on this video. It is a huge, huge help. And if you'd like to check out this clip's full podcast episode, that link is in the description below or right here. And finally, you can follow me on Instagram and X by using the links in my description below.